everyone. It's the 21st of May, 2023, and this is the People-Centered Internet Community Call. Delighted to have you with us. We have Ashley Anderson with us today as our guest. Ashley is a graduate student pursuing her PhD at North Carolina State University in the College of Design. And as you'll remember, we've had Helen Armstrong on, who wrote a book about design and AI about half a year ago, and she was delightful. And I was able to spend some time with Ashley recently in a graduate review of projects, and I really found her work compelling, fascinating. Ashley, tell us a little bit about your background before we dive into your presentation.
Yeah, sure. So of course I am in my entering my fourth year in the PhD program here at NC State. Just passed my exams recently, so now I'm a candidate getting ready for
Outstanding.
Putting together the study. But my background is in graphic design, so I have a master's in graphic design also from NC State. But prior to that, I got a Bachelor of Arts in Journalism and Mass Communication from UNC Chapel Hill. And so I bring a lot of my kind of writing and journalism background forward into my design research and kind of teaching. More recently, I've been really interested in artificial intelligence and AI. And I think NC State has been a really great place to kind of explore that, with us being kind of, having so much of our technology and engineering fields and even in the College of Design, so.
Outstanding. Well, we're really happy to have you with us. We look forward to seeing exactly what you're pursuing, and you'll probably get some comments, just like I gave you some encouragement and some other places that you might want to look to make your PhD thesis just that much more rich and compelling, so that we can say Dr. Anderson, right, in the not too distant future. So please, we're delighted to have you with us. And anyone, if you want to put questions, put them in chat. And then when we get to the Q&A session, I'll call on you in order. It's all yours, Ashley.
Sounds great. Thank you so much. So I'll share my screen. All right, is that good?
We can see it.
Okay, awesome. So again, I'm Ashley Anderson. My advisor at NC State is Dr. Matthew Peterson, though I do work with Helen Armstrong. She is on my committee as well. Today, I'll be talking a bit about my ongoing research. I've kind of put it under this umbrella of leveraging text-to-image AI in design research, and I'll use my ongoing research as kind of a case of that. Let's see. All right, to get started, I'll kind of outline the presentation. So I'll talk a little bit, I've already talked about my background, but a little bit about kind of my trajectory from my master's thesis, because I think it plays a big role in where I've ended up. And then I'll go into my dissertation research, giving you kind of a view of the literature and theory that I'm pulling from, the intervention that I'm working on developing, how I'm leveraging text-to-image AI, and kind of some of the insights and takeaways that I've been able to pull that I think are really interesting for other design research or just research that is using AI as a tool in general. So my kind of research journey starts very interestingly with this worksheet. This is called a thought record, and it is used in the context mostly of cognitive behavioral therapy as a tool for this like metacognitive process. And so as I was looking into what I wanted to focus my master's thesis on, I came across this, and what it is it's 7 columns where a person, usually in the context of therapy with a therapist, is asked to think about situations that might trigger anxiety or depression, and think about feelings that are associated with that, think about maladaptive thoughts that they might be having. And then they have the opportunity to think about evidence that either supports or goes against that, with the kind of idea of arriving at an alternative, kind of more balanced perspective. And so I was really interested in this process overall. And so I started to look at, how might design be used to help kind of facilitate these kinds of interventions. And so my thesis, it's a bit of a mouthful, but it was working with imagery, so mediating imagery scripting for anxiety with multimodal digital storytelling. And all that was me being interested in the idea that we have estimated 32% of adults in the US who experience anxiety at some point in their lives. But there's this lack of access to treatment, whether that's because it is time consuming, but also because it's costly. And then there's also stigma associated with that. And so I was really interested in tools that were aimed at kind of bringing more access to these kind of resources more directly. And a lot of those kind of took the form of mobile applications for self-help. So you've probably seen things like Headspace was kind of buzzing, those kind of mindfulness apps. But what I saw was that a lot of these resources were kind of taking that thought record and kind of putting it on a device screen, like just making it kind of more of a static tool, and weren't really taking advantage of the affordances of the technology. And so I was really interested in how a digital tool, be it on the phone, is kind of what I focus on, might be used to kind of facilitate this process. And what is it about this kind of digital device that makes it mobile, that you have sound, that you have audio, that you can have animation, that would be helpful to that process. So I tried to kind of pull from imagery-based interventions in traditional therapeutic contexts, but also thinking about visual strategies for engaging with thoughts that arise as mental imagery, basically. So I ended up kind of going through a few different research questions. So the biggest one was thinking about how a digital therapy tool might be used to kind of facilitate this process, but that took the form of kind of even more smaller sub-questions. So thinking about how you can use or leverage personal visualizations and metaphor to actually create pictures that represent mental imagery, thinking about how such a system, in the absence of a therapist, might suggest alternative views and perspectives. And the goal at this point was not to replace a therapist or to replace the process of therapy, but really thinking about augmenting kind of the self-help aspect of it. So if you're familiar with CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy, it's not meant to be a long-term thing. It's meant to be kind of a short-term treatment where you get a variety of tools that you can use in your daily life to kind of cope. And so I was interested in that piece, but also thinking about how visuals could be used to kind of interrupt those negative thinking patterns, and thinking about how all this could come together in one system. So I ended up mocking up an app. I did not develop anything because the thesis project takes place over the course of a year. So that's not a short time, but it's not really a long time either in the context of research. But here I ended up kind of taking that thought record and putting it into a conversational user interface, where a user would be kind of speaking with the system. And as it's kind of reflecting on what they're saying, it's encouraging them to get to language that is more visual. So in this case, it's a metaphor. So here a person says that they feel like they're drowning. And when you get to that visual imagery, it prompts you to create a picture that represents that. From there, being interested in how this kind of system might help to kind of draw attention to thinking patterns, I started to think about how it might suggest opportunities to consider something different. So in this case, this is where a user might be exhibiting what's called black or white thinking, thinking that something is either all one way or all the other. So they have one picture that says they feel like they're drowning, and the other one is they're keeping their head above water. And so you have a system that starts to kind of push these two together to ask the user to think about something that's in between. And so maybe it's that, the waves don't stop, but I can handle things that come my way. So thinking about that in between space and drawing that to a user's attention. After that, I was really interested in how these kinds of resources might build up over time. So in the context of therapy with that worksheet, people would lose it or just not keep track of them over time. There was no real opportunity to revisit it. And so I was really interested in how a system like this might be able to log, almost like a diary, these different entries, and how a person might revisit them even through a process of like engaging with them through an animation. So in this scenario, they would kind of like press a button and press and hold and see the negative imagery transform into the alternative that they came up with. So from this, I said that it was over the course of a year. So there were lots of things that I got to explore, but some things that I just didn't. So takeaways and things that I was still thinking about when I finished was, one, how to establish an informed strategy around visualization and visual representation. So in the scenario where you could create anything, how do you decide what to make? And then also thinking about, design considerations around anxiety and cognition. There's a lot of research that points to kind of working memory being affected by anxiety, and how might that kind of inform the way that you design such a system. Also thinking about the affordances of mobile digital devices. So here, like I mentioned at the time, apps like Headspace. There was another one, I think it's Mood or Mindful or something similar to that, were kind of emerging. So I kind of stayed in that space, but I was really interested in how interventions like this might be extended to other, technologies or other, kind of digital devices or realms. And then lastly, I was really interested in implications for practice and other types of intervention. So I mentioned before, this is my thesis research. And in the middle of this process, I felt like I really kind of got into my groove with the design research aspect. And I actually had one of my professors, asked me if I considered the PhD program. And at that point I hadn't. This was kind of right in the middle of COVID. So we left for spring break and didn't really come back. And so I decided to go into the PhD program, but that kind of brought up the challenge of, okay, what is my research interest? What do I want to bring forward from this thesis work to the, dissertation to the doctoral level? And so I kind of thought about, the context of, okay, I'm going to actually have to do this study. Am I going to lean as heavily on the therapeutic sides of things, or are there other avenues for intervention? So as I mentioned, I'm at NC State. We are a huge engineering and tech campus. And so I started to think about how I might kind of take advantage of the opportunity or the surroundings of where I am. And for now, I am developing an intervention. I'm calling it mediated rescripting. It is a stereotype threat intervention for Black undergraduate students in engineering. To set the scene for this and to give an idea of the problem area, we have this rapid growth in STEM fields, engineering and technology, but the proportion of bachelor's degrees that are earned by Black students in engineering has remained largely stagnant, and in some cases fallen. And so there's been a lot of research that attributes this pattern to stereotype threat. And that basically is anxiety about confirming negative stereotypes about one's group. And a lot of the research has kind of highlighted the relationship between stereotype threat to sense of belonging and identity with a discipline or a domain. And so researchers have suggested that interventions should support Black engineering students in developing an engineering identity, a sense of belonging, and things like that. And so I'm offering mediated rescripting as a novel stereotype threat that uses AI-generated pictures to facilitate engagement with mental imagery, so personally relevant mental imagery related to belonging, and having that formalized as visual metaphor. And my working hypothesis is that participation in this intervention will increase engineering identity and sense of belonging while decreasing anxiety and stress. So a little bit about the intervention. Right now, it is made up of 2 phases. There is an elicitation and visualization phase, and also an engagement phase. So in the elicitation and visualization phase, this is kind of taking place in the form of a workshop, which I'll talk about later. There is mental imagery related to the experience of belonging and being a Black student in engineering that's going to be captured through a focused reflection on experience, which is basically going to be a discussion. So asking students, what is it like for you as a Black undergraduate student at NC State, in engineering? and having students formulate metaphors to describe that process and to use those metaphors to create pictures that represent challenges that they face, but also what it looks like to what coping looks like, what overcoming might look like. I mean, I think it's important to note that, you know, I don't think the onus should be on students to kind of address this problem, but I think, you know, in the absence of kind of these larger systemic solutions, thinking about ways that to get students to persist in engineering while they're here. So after this, creating this imagery, there will be engagement over the course of a semester where there's repeated viewing of this kind of challenge imagery with reflective comparison to the kind of overcoming challenge picture, or this this kind of aspirational kind of goal. And so to kind of take a few steps backward to kind of talk about how I got to that intervention and to kind of tie it to the earlier thesis research, it is still, I think, very rooted in this idea of cognitive restructuring that's used in cognitive behavioral therapy, and also really concerned with mental imagery. So CBT, as I mentioned before, I was really interested in thinking about the context of anxiety. But what I've also found is that it's not always used to address psychological disorders, but also non-medical concerns and just daily life challenges. Just being able to think about your own thinking and thinking about, you know, are my thoughts maladaptive? Are they helpful to me, or are they causing me more stress? And then I've also been really interested in mental imagery. And when I say that, I mean representations that come from memory rather than directly from the senses. So, you know, if I say fire truck, you could probably see one and maybe hear it without it being in front of you. But really being interested in mental imagery because a lot of the research suggests that mental images are more realistic and elicit more emotion than verbal thoughts. And a lot of the kind of traditional therapeutic route, this kind of verbal medium is used either through conversation or writing. So I was really interested in this kind of imagery piece, especially as a designer, because I felt like it connected really well to pictures. So within imagery, I started looking at, okay, in the therapeutic context, how are people engaging with imagery? And started to come across something that's called imagery rescripting, which is a technique that involves visually recalling and re-experiencing thoughts and images related to distressing events. So traditionally, this has been used in the context of PTSD for things that have happened in the past. But more recently, there's been a lot of work about mental imagery related to future events. So these kind of like things that you might anticipate or worry about happening. And so thinking about how you might reframe those so that they don't cause you distress. But the challenge with this is that it requires therapy clients to kind of hold and manipulate their mental imagery in their head, which can be challenging for a lot of people. So that gets me back to the idea of pictures. So I started to look at how pictures are being used in the context of therapy now with mental imagery. And I came across quite a few papers and a little bit of a mini lit review. On the right, I've included some pictures from a therapy client who was asked to create imagery or pictures around their experience or fear of people like watching or judging them. And so the first picture on the top with the giant eye is one that they drew kind of representing all eyes being on them and worried about, you know, kind of being judged. While the second one was an alternative that they were prompted to create that was intended to reflect a more likely scenario where, you know, they're in the center and they're thinking about everyone else while everyone else is thinking about themselves. And so you can see that these are conceptually related, but I was really interested in kind of the visual aspect of them. So these were kind of created, it looks like with different materials. It looks like they could have been made at different times. And at some point, if I didn't know that the same person created these, I might think that it was a different person. So I started to think about, I had those kind of visual aspects in my mind as well. But some of the functions that I saw for pictures as they're used now is one, them being tools for sense making. So being able to kind of tangibly take your mental imagery and get it down on the page becomes this process where you can think through things that may not always be in your awareness at the moment. Once you kind of get these pictures down, they become an artifact for interpretation. So something that you can point to, something that you could look at with someone else. Also a safe space, so a way to kind of explore alternatives in a kind of low stakes environment. Similar to, you know, setting boundaries and like exercising control over the imagery. But all this comes together. I mean, I start to think about these pictures as external cognitive aids for these kind of intervention processes. And so kind of building from that and thinking about, you know, how can an intervention kind of make, kind of leverage those visual strategies. I started to look at why people say cognitive behavioral therapy works, why it's working with imagery works, to start to see if that pointed to visual strategies. And so what I found is that not everybody agrees. There are a lot of different explanations for why it works. But one that I kind of connected with was this idea of retrieval competition theory. So this is the idea that therapy doesn't directly change information in memory, but produces changes in like the activation of representations that people have. And so then the goal of therapy is to help, you know, these positive imagery, these positive representations win out against the negative ones. And so I started looking at things like competitive memory training, which is a specific techniques that aims to produce that preferential recall by first identifying dysfunctional meanings that are high. So things that are negative that you kind of go to first and that you automatically think about, but also identifying things that are maybe more functional, that you have a harder time thinking about. And so thinking about how those things can be switched. So making those positive representations more easily retrievable, engaging with them more, and enhancing the kind of emotional connection to them. So you can see this starts to all kind of come together when you think about, you know, the imagery, the pictures, and metaphor and things like that. And so trying to bridge the gap between mental imagery and a picture presented a bit of a challenge, because it's, you know, how concrete is this mental imagery? What does it look like? How do you get from that to a picture? And so I started making the case for metaphor, particularly because metaphor is part of the way that we think. It is, you know, about understanding one thing in terms of another. So example, argument is war. But it's not only a rhetorical device, it's how we kind of make sense of the world. And so I started to see, you know, this mental imagery, visual, conceptual metaphor, and picture kind of all lining up, especially when I start to look at literature around the idea that people have two information processing systems. So, you know, one that encodes in symbols, words, and numbers, and the other that encodes in images, metaphors, and narratives. So starting to think how these things can line up. I made the case for metaphor. So conceptual metaphor, if you kind of break it down, there are different aspects. So one is a target domain. So that is basically the experience you're trying to describe. And then there's a source domain that is experience that you are kind of referencing to describe the target. And then you start to have what's called entailment, or these kind of small mappings between relationships. So thinking about, you know, love is something that progresses over time and how that might map to distance covered and so on, when you start to think about relationships. So in the context of research, I started to think about, okay, so I have mental imagery and there are pictures that I want to get to, and I think that metaphor might be a way to get there, but how do I get people to come up with metaphors around, you know, the mental imagery or the thoughts they have? And so I started to look at other research that kind of relied on this elicitation of metaphor. And there was actually quite a bit in education research, which I didn't expect. But I came across this model from Graham Lowe that's fairly simple, but it starts with a participant that is acting, believing, or experiencing. They formulate those things as a metaphor. And then you have a researcher who might intervene or recommend not to change the metaphor, but to further develop it or strengthen it. And then the idea is that by the participant kind of altering this metaphor, they might alter their behavior or their way of thinking. And so this started to kind of map on quite nicely. But it still kind of left a lot of questions. And so I started to look at actual studies where people were using this model. So there's a study by Juan in 2012 where they were asking ESL students to create metaphors around the experience of academic writing. So what is it like to write a paper for a class, or to think about that experience? And what they found is that a lot of students kind of struggled with that. And they identified kind of four main reasons, three I'll cover here, for that difficulty. And so one was a limited understanding of metaphor. Another was uncertainty about topics. So students knew that they were supposed to be talking about academic writing, but they were like, okay, what aspect of academic writing? And then the last one was there was no standardized like structure to write out the metaphor. And so some students, wrote it one way, or some students wrote another way. And so the researcher had a hard time kind of bringing those together. So as I'm taking all of this literature and kind of building up towards this intervention that I'm envisioning as a workshop, I start to think about what this might suggest about what I need to include in the intervention. So first, thinking, okay, there needs to be some kind of metaphor primer, no matter how brief, just to make sure that everyone's on the same page. There needs to be this focused reflection on experience. So when I'm asking students about what it's like to be a Black undergraduate engineering student, I need to be asking them specifically about, the classroom and their sense of belonging and how they identify with their major. And then lastly, having a clear prompting structure that participants can kind of write into, so that there's this kind of the format for them that they're not having to worry too hard about, how they write it and present it. So that leads me to leveraging text to image AI. So I kind of built up towards this workshop, and then I was like, oh, now we have to actually create the pictures. How is that going to happen? Particularly for people who might not be used to creating images or doing anything with imagery, what is that going to look like? And so I started looking at text to image AI, things like DALL-E and Midjourney, which use natural language descriptions through a process of diffusion to create images. These are some of the early explorations I did up front of, asking DALL-E to generate imagery of an invisible human, and it creating these really kind of creepy pictures that were technically right, but weren't kind of fitting for like the experience you were trying to convey. And so I started to kind of think, oh, I'm thinking text to image might be a way to kind of remove the barrier of like individual artistic skill, but there's a lot of skill that's involved in prompting these systems. And so that becomes something that I'm considering now. And so DALL-E, I'm not sure how many people are familiar with it, but it has its own kind of interface. And you enter a text description, usually consisting of a content, so what you want to be in the picture, and then having modifiers. So it could be, the view, it could be a specific type of medium or style that you want to use. But you can also create variations from what's generated. And something that I really found kind of nice about DALL-E in the context of being able to kind of have control over what you generate is being able to kind of erase and regenerate things in its place. So here in this editing part, I was able to erase what was on the screen, which was really nothing, and generate something else in its place. So it kind of gives you this capability to edit beyond just the original kind of text description that you use. Then I started looking at Midjourney, which was a little bit more of a learning curve because Midjourney is built into Discord, which is a kind of messaging platform. It has an API that you can access, but I think this is the easiest for beginners. And so you can start to kind of type in your text descriptions. And one thing that you'll notice about these text to image systems is they each have their own kind of like in-house style to them. But there are kind of ways that you can kind of turn up or turn down the style to get a little bit more control. So I started actually taking the pictures that I created in DALL-E and throwing them into Midjourney to see, okay, what are the capabilities here? What can I do with them? What do they look like? How might I alter them? To start to think about, what system am I gonna have be as part of this workshop, as a part of this intervention, basically. So these are kind of more early visual studies. As you saw before, those were kind of more general pictures, but I wanted to start getting into the content. So when I tell people that I'm interested in Black undergraduate engineering students creating pictures around their kind of sense of belonging, I think there's a lot of questions about what that looks like and what that means. And so I started going to the literature at first to see, how students describe their experience. And so this is one example I did of a Black student sitting in a desk in a crowded college classroom illustration. And so in this one, I never actually mentioned the fact that they were the only Black student, but I thought it was really interesting that DALL-E kind of picked up on that and made that decision on its own. And started to think about what it might look like to edit this. Are they thinking about, another situation where they felt like they belong more, so maybe in an ice cream social or something like that. So just going through this process to start to see like what would this actual imagery look like. Even further, I started to look at the literature on how African-American STEM students describe their sense of belonging and how it's inhibited or inspired, and started pulling metaphors from this. So one example here is a student was saying that they felt unseen or ignored by instructors and peers. And so I kind of mapped that onto this idea or feeling of invisibility, and then generated two images. So the one being the negative image being obscured by this haze, and the other being an alternative where they feel visible and confident. Another one was being inundated with constant reminders of negative stereotypes. So thinking about what that might look like as a metaphor, being caught in a barrage of objects and having to defend yourself, and having the alternative being able to kind of counter those negatives with reinforced positive messages and beliefs and kind of, wielding power over them. And so this is kind of where I ended up with the intervention/workshop structure, thinking about, a metaphor primer, focus, reflection on experience, this formulation of a metaphor, being able to take that metaphor primer and say like, hey, is this metaphor going to be adequate or something that can be visualized, and then getting to the actual visualization stages. And so I actually did run this workshop with design students. That's who I had access to at the moment. But I started to think about what I was, as a facilitator, was doing, what participants would be doing, thinking about how long this would take and what resources I realistically had access to. So to kind of start to wrap up my insights on this so far, I think things that have come up from me, especially since I'm interested this in the context of stereotype threat intervention with Black students, is, how do you conduct research in a way that accounts for ethical concerns surrounding racial bias in AI training data? That's something that has come up a lot, and I've done kind of a deep dive into the systems to see how the developers are working to mitigate risk and reduce harm, and making specific choices based on that. I've seen some literature that says, oh, we shouldn't use it for this kind of research at all. And I think for me, I think like other systems that we have to kind of dig into and dismantle and to restructure, I think that we can approach AI the same way. And then lastly, I started thinking about how you might design interactions that support the prompting skills. So I'm going to have engineering students engage with this who may or may not be familiar with the technology. So how do I get them engaged with it? But also, ongoing question is thinking about, how do you problematize and navigate visual representation in this kind of AI context? So to wrap up my methodology that I'm going to be using, so I'm going to have this intervention. I'm going to be doing an experiment. So I'll be measuring taking some pretest measures around racial climate, how students feel like they belong, their engineering identity, and then I'll be following that up kind of at the end of this. This study will be taking place over the course of a semester. So I'll do a pretest, and then I'm planning to do what's called a ecological momentary assessment, which is basically like a daily diary. So for 3 week-long periods, throughout the semester, I will gather data from students. And that is just to kind of make sure that they don't get like fatigued by doing this every day. So they'll only have to do it every day for like 1 week here, and then they'll have a little bit of time, they'll do 1 week here. And yeah, so this kind of maps that out. I'll be working with hopefully about 35 students. And yeah, so it's gonna kind of go through this process. I'm still in the I'm in the IRB phase now, where I'm writing to them to say how I'm actually going to do this. So, you know, best of luck there. I know it's going to take a bit of work, but I think that is it for me.
Thank you, Ashley. Now, as we got to the end, you used an acronym. I don't IRB. What is that?
Oh, IRB. So that's the I think it's Institutional Review Board. So they're basically, yeah, who you have to write. Right. You're doing human subjects research, you have to get it approved. And so they're really concerned with, you know, how are you going to protect information?
Sure.
You know, basically have to be really specific. So that's the process that I'm in now.
All right. I'm sure that those who are in academic institutions, that they immediately knew what that was. I didn't. Okay.
And sympathize immediately.
Yes.
Yeah, basically the IRB are the people who look over human-centered research and all the privacy and the things like that you have to consider.
All right, very good. Ashley, that's great. We did have some questions, and I'm sure more will come up as we move forward. Okay. Let me just DJ Allen, I think that is the is what I'm looking at as a screen name. You did a post. You were the first person to post. Any thing that you'd like to ask Ashley this morning? If it's morning for you.
Well, it's definitely morning. I was actually thinking about her thesis regarding the impact of being isolated or different in a classroom. And so the engineering students was an excellent example because I had the exact same experience, myself and 5 others, 3 of which have gone on to build systems for the military and others. But really my point is that it's an excellent point of view to look at what happens with underrepresented students in classrooms where the professor has a bias toward them or is definitely someone they can't logically pick from their background. So I just thought it was an excellent idea. It's an excellent choice.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that comment. Ben, you were next. You had several comments that you put into chat. We would be glad to hear from you.
Yeah, a couple of quick things. First of all, I very much enjoyed your discussion of the evolution of your thought process and thought activity, because we often hear the end product, here's what I'm doing. And it was very nice and refreshing to see the evolution of your thought to framing the question and your methods and approaches to it. I was also intrigued by the notion of the fact that you happen to personally do have a twin, and the concept that in some sense the creation of the twin of mental models as a means of focus for discussion, differentiation, and manipulation, rather than trying to force or challenge a mental model that someone has, and that possibly the best way to inform an individual's mental model might be by a discussion and discourse on the analog, the metaphor model that they create as a basis for discussion, as sort of a safe venue to address and defend or challenge a mental model. So I thought, and I think the approach that you're doing with the visualization is very important to that end too. It's very different from having somebody describe a narrative of their perception of their mental model, and yet they can test the analog, the metaphor that you're creating with the text to image engine. When your Midjourney engine, I can say that's not like it, or pick the one of 4, or amplify this one. And a very nice sandbox and mixture of both the psychology and the technology. Well done.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would think that this would be a very interesting augmentation for what's known as ZMET, the Zaltman method elicitation technique, ZMET. It uses, a multimodal way of, getting people to respond to stimulus, right? That is, sensory in nature. So, in addition to what you're doing with visual, the question, would also be, are there auditory or other, signals that are coming into, the system? You talk about language, but it isn't always language, right? It's other things that are happening in the environment. So I don't want to expand your thesis to the point where you can't finish your program, but I just encourage you, after you're done with the path you've selected, that you may want to be multisensory, right, in nature, to get a complete picture.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's come up a lot too. So when I was looking at mental imagery, I think a lot of people go to the visual, but mental imagery is also something that's multimodal. So it occurs in all the senses. But like you said, for the context of the dissertation, having to kind of narrow it, but I'm seeing this as just the start, and I would be really interested in kind of following up with those other considerations as well.
That's, an early career experience I had, Ashley, was that when we were at a site where a lot of people hadn't moved their families in, and we were the early team, is that we spent so much time with each other, that there was a very strong bond, right, with the group of people who were, doing this kind of early stakeholder, building, right, in a particular community. It was interesting. Then I moved to a larger headquarters location for the company I was working for. And at the end of the day, everybody went in different directions, right? They all just kind of evaporated, right, into, different suburbs in different places. And so I never had that sensibility again of that kind of ability to, until very late career, where I was back where we were relatively, close to each other with a particular group. So that, I think, also is what happens when the class disbands. Where does everybody go? All right. And how do the study groups form, and so on and so forth? Those would all be interesting. All right. So we also heard from Anjana, and would be delighted to have you join the conversation. Made some observations in chat. I'm pronouncing your name correctly.
Actually, it is pronounced as Anjana.
Anjana, thank you for helping me. I knew I was probably getting it wrong.
No, it's I think tenable because of the spelling. So
Yes.
like it's an Indian name, but spelled.
Well, thank you for helping me pronounce it correctly, Anjana. So for Ashley, you have a thought?
About,
I'm trying to see, but she just went off.
okay.
And she dropped. No, there she is.
I see a question.
Okay, hold on, maybe.
So my question was related to the process of communication, where the language plays a very important role, especially in case of climate change. I'm a sustainability professional, and during my interaction with people, I found that, and you also mentioned about that psychological distancing when it comes to climate change. But I had created an infographic, and this infographic on how climate change is leading to climate migration and leading to loss of languages. And this loss of languages often, result into loss of local knowledge. So this was one point I'm very passionate about, that, the languages are getting lost in somewhere, lost in translation, the meaning.
So
Yeah, I think on the slide that I showed where my thesis, there was a portion underneath that was talking about climate change communication. That's not my project. It's on the same website though, and I can share that link to you. One of my colleagues, Victoria Gerson, who is teaching at the University of Florida, does a lot of research, or did her thesis on climate change, and has kind of followed up on that with the idea of the language. So I can share that resource with you. I'm sure she'll be much, you'll find much.
I'll appreciate that. Thank you, Ashley. So
Yes, of course.
that's great. Also, you had a chart about English as second language, or ESL students.
Yes.
And so that's kind of related to what we were just discussing, is perhaps there are, concepts in other languages that aren't fully present in the classroom, right? That there is no great translation for something, and that could be an opportunity for, rather than trying to, translate, is to import a concept and bring in a new word, for something that's not well described in English. I mean, we have certainly borrowed from other languages. We're a borrowing language, so.
That's a really good point. I'm actually working on a research project right now that is around like language analysts. And so we've been thinking about, AI and language, and how do you, with what we've been experimenting a little, but we were like, yeah, what do you do when you have those things that don't necessarily translate? How do you, like what you said, import the concept and look at the imagery? One of the students on our team, her name is Isha, she speaks Hindi. And so we did a few kind of iterations where we were looking at metaphors in English and metaphors in Hindi, and kind of figures of speech to see what the AI would do. We were using ChatGPT, and it did better than we thought, but there were definitely still some challenges to bringing that in. So we started to think about, okay, if you have a language analyst that's using this technology, they might be working with data or information in another language. And then you have not only the literal language, but then you have like figurative subtext, does it capture that? So I definitely think that there's a lot to be done there. Super interesting.
Yeah, the one that I've imported for sure is the Japanese term wabi-sabi, okay, which is the appreciation for imperfections, right? Is that, that's something that is, has broken and has been put back together, right, or repaired, is now so unique, right, that it's more valuable, right? It's an interesting concept. So Doug Coolin, you're joining us and put some thoughts into chat. Glad to have you with us.
Yes, thank you so much. I appreciated what you had to share. Thank you. One question I had is, as you're having the students use these tools, do you have a feel for their background? How often do they use these tools already? How much training are you going to have around that? I think
it kind of varies a bit. So the original pilots I did were with actual design students. And interesting enough, most of them had used the technology, but not for this specific reason. It was more experimental. And so there was still a learning curve that I hadn't expected. So I'm not sure with the engineering students, I'm expecting that maybe some of them who are kind of interested in the computer science background of it and the coding might have experimented a little bit more than others. But something that my advisors have been kind of talking to me about is like, how are you going to get around people who might be new to it, the novelty, the distraction, because that we did have kind of a challenge with that in the pilot. And so part of that is kind of having a part built in where there's some kind of practice of engaging with this, so they don't go straight into the imagery. There's like a kind of buffer period where you can kind of get out the novelty, or, oh, I created something really funny and kooky and weird, and then kind of get into where they can actually start to see it as a tool versus like a toy, I guess. So I'm still trying to get a sense. I think it's going to depend on the participants that I get. I would guess maybe some more of the computer science kind of engineering folks might be maybe more familiar, but I don't have a great sense as of yet.
Okay, yeah, I've given a number of workshops and lunch and learns on generative AI to different educational organizations. And what I do is I do a pre-survey of their backgrounds, like what tools have they used. If it's helpful, I can send you some information on that. And
That would be wonderful.
like the survey I use, because it's always nice to understand where people are coming from, and then, do they have a strong background? Then each person, some people can be real strong, some people not so strong in using these tools. And of course, the tools are changing constantly.
Yes.
So, that's the other, to learn how to use the tools. And so those are some of the things, maybe you may want to think about.
I think that's a great a point, and something I think that has come up in the past of, is there some way to measure or see, are the effects stronger for people who have a stronger background with AI? You might expect to see that difference. And so I do think I would love to see the information about that pre-survey, because that might be something that I should include.
Yeah, and I guess my one comment too is, like, I might have an engineering background myself, but I'm doing a lot with images, and I'm really enjoying that artwork. In fact, when I talk about 9 types of intelligence, and so there's mathematical intelligence, there's art intelligence. My art intelligence is horrible, but with this tool, I can amplify, that very small spark to do amazing things. So, if for students who don't have an engineering background, don't have a technology background, they can still use these tools to do amazing things. And that would be one of the comments, to say, hey, you don't have to be a computer science person or a machine learning person to use these tools.
Yes, absolutely.
Thanks, Doug. Appreciate it. Lynn, I have a question. The foundational point in this presentation was mediated rescripting, right? That's the primary concept here. I'm wondering whether the work that you're currently engaged with others in leadership with Puerto Rico, whether mediated rescripting would have a role to play in some of the things that you're considering as a program. I'm just curious whether there's any.
So I'm actually looking through the 2022 top projects, and this is the opportunity project from. Let me call up my file here.
That's a census.
From the Census Bureau.
Mm-hmm.
And one of them was on, let's see. I'm trying to remember how this was phrased. Well, the one was enhancing children's resilience to adversity in Puerto Rico.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was another on national developing community-informed national level indicators of well-being.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was just wondering if some of these might provide, and the other thing, of course, is what we heard from Jose Morey a few weeks ago,
Right.
about the all the different types of communications that he's promoting through at Astra. So I was wondering the other piece, I don't know, I haven't gotten into it deeply enough, but the federal long-term equitable federal plan for equitable long-term recovery and resilience, which is designed to get us past COVID, has a fair chunk of things in there on mental health.
Mhm.
And I was just wondering if some of the things that Ashley's working on might tie into giving people better indicators of how folks are feeling and things like that. Alternatively, in the same mode, what could you do to evaluate how people are responding to disasters?
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, because you could elicit a different typology of response that would potentially be more helpful to both the individual and the community that they're part of. Ashley, you didn't have an opportunity to hear the previous presentation by this gentleman, Jose Moret, but he was using comic books as a methodology for introducing, aspirational things for, people who have different cultural backgrounds that are kind of aligned to his background. Where was he? He said he was originally from Dominican Republic.
Well, no, he calls himself a Puerto Rican doctor. And I think his
Okay,
family.
but was his dad or mom from DR?
Yeah, I'm not sure he grew up very much in Puerto Rico, but he's just perfectly bilingual. And
Yeah.
he called him a Puerto Rican doctor. And his company Ad Astra,
Mhm.
it teaches STEM, it's actually STEAM, adding art and design, into Latina youth. And what he uses is a mixed media from children's books to comic books to young
Mhm.
adult graphic novels to immersive video games to absolutely world-class AI, AR, VR, XR, in order to be able to reach young people irrespective of their degree of internet access or their social status. And he's been doing a lot of work with NASA, for example, on this. One of the things he put together was a comic book called La Borequeña, which is a Puerto Rican woman who's a earth scientist or a environmental scientist who basically comes across some rocks that gives her the superpowers of the ancient Taino gods, which were the gods of Puerto Rico. Anyway, it's become apparently the most rapidly distributed Latinx comic in that market, in terms of inspiring young people about, gee, there's somebody out there like me who could be a superhero. So I think there's a lot of overlap there potentially, and be interested to pursue it.
Yeah, it was just that I was making the connection that Lynn just did much better than I could, because he knows Jose so much better than I do. That he's using those different media forms as a mediated, rescripting for those younger populations, Ashley. So it's just,
Yeah, I was struck by
spirit.
the image you had there of the unseen Black students in the classroom, converting them into eating ice cream or having some sort of instead of deflecting the incoming rocks with a book or whatever, having some sort of a force field to so anyway, I think there's some interesting links there.
Yeah.
Was that presentation? Was that presentation recorded?
Yeah, I'll get it to you.
Okay, great.
We know in popular media that the primetime cartoons do things and say things that you could never get away with real people, actors on screen. So, Ben, you've been commenting again. I just want to let everyone know we're at the bottom of the hour, and if you need to scoot, we understand. We thank you for being with us. We're about to go into our overtime Q&A. So if you would like to stay, ask more questions, Ashley's glad to be with us. So thanks for being with us on this call. Ben, you had some more thoughts?
Yeah,
Good to hear
a couple of thoughts I wanted to relate. I had done some work in the past on looking at diversion, augmented reality and virtual world environments for immersion, for distracting children under pediatric treatment for oncology or radiology, or chemotherapy. And when I look at also the address of using AR and VR on phobias now, that your work, which is beginning and focuses right now on the static image, will move into more full immersion, and in vivo construction, a living world that will be immersive. And it'll be more interesting to look at how that enacted environment would more and more reflect a mental model and allow people to validate and explore and accept their mental model, and accept that that mental model can be challenged, disrupted, augmented, enhanced, enriched, and other ways. So you're at the beginning of a fabulous sandbox. This is an entire career for you, Ashley. I don't have to ask, I don't have to ask, what are you going to be when you grow up?
Yeah, I mean, even just like being here, I'm always talking to my advisor, and I'm like, oh, it would really be cool to do this. So it'd be really cool to do this next. And he's always reminding me, this is just the start, but it is really exciting to have something already that is, so rich that you can go so many different avenues with, and really, build a research career. So very excited.
Yes, that's great. I see Jim is posting something in chat, and I was actually going to call on you, Jim, because Jim is very involved in service industry innovation, Ashley. And again, I see some parallels between what you're exploring and being able to apply mediated rescripting methodology to better outcomes between interactions between people and organizations, because a lot of times there's a mismatch. There's an like electricity, an impedance mismatch, right, between the expectations of one group or another. Jim, I know you joined late, but
yeah, I did.
Maybe you got
sorry
enough out of this that you could comment.
I got a lot out of the part that I heard, and really look forward to watching the recording, because it sounds like I missed some great stuff. So I have Ashley, only a partial view of what you're working on because I joined late, but I would like to, if there is a URL to learn more about mediated scripting, or I learn by reading, so it'd be great to get that URL. I used to ask people in, like starting 5 or 10 years ago, I said, what goal would you work on if you had 100 digital workers working for you? Because I found that, managers in big corporations, I've worked for IBM and Apple, so I've managed hundreds of people. And when you're thinking about, you've got 100 people or more in your organization, you have to think about, what important goals, bigger and bigger goals. So I used to ask people, what would you do if you had 100 digital workers working for you? But these days, so I could ask you that question. I'd love to hear your response. The other question I'd love to hear your response on, though, because of the work you're doing in generative AI, is if you had to distill the benefit of generative AI into one biggest benefit, and I'm happy to share with you what I think it is, but what do you think it is? What is the biggest single benefit of generative AI as it exists today in the world?
I think that's a really good question, and something that I've, in my work with Professor Helen Armstrong, who I mentioned before, I work on a research project, something that we talk about and think about a lot. And so I think, instinctively, I think people kind of go with what they think about like technology or automation in general, it's like, oh, we can do more stuff, right?
Mhm.
So that might be an obvious, way, but I really, one of the strengths that I think of AI, even generative AI for me, is as a collaborator, and challenging the way that I think about things. So, when I've used ChatGPT to write prompts for text to image AI because I'm interested in how it would ask the AI to create an image versus what I would say. And so I think for me, I would say the collaborative aspect of working with the technology. I don't think just having the AI do what we do is gonna cut it. I think that it requires a little bit of nuance, a little bit of more kind of this idea of being able to kind of challenge your own thought processes to get something that you didn't expect from the AI, to engage with it in a way that you might not expect. So I think my first intuition when I first started using these text image systems and like ChatGPT was I wanted to write to it in a way that I would understand, like I was writing to another person. And so having to learn, okay, what is the language? How would the system communicate? And I think what you end up finding is that it's really interesting that it's not human-like at all. It's very, it'll do things in very kind of what seemed convoluted to us. But I just think of it as a really powerful collaborator. So I hope that answers.
Yeah, that's a fantastic answer. I was reminded, and I put in the chat, that getting another perspective on things. So often when you're working, especially by yourself, maybe it's late, there's nobody else around to talk to, and you want another perspective on something, you can read, of course, look and read, but the idea that the biggest benefit of generative AI is on-demand another perspective, I think is a great way to view it. My view is human tendency is to procrastinate. We get a goal and we think, oh, that's a good goal. I'll do that tomorrow or next week, or I've got to do a little more research before I get started. And I find that with the generative AI systems, it's so easy to, like you say, get that other perspective. Just, boom, it's going to go to work instantly. And it may be full of factual errors, and it may be wrong, and it may, have problems. But at least you get, something quickly that can help overcome the tendency to procrastinate, I think is what I see in my life, at least. That's how
that's a great example. I mean, I've started even in just small things. So while I was writing my proposal, I would write chunks of my own kind of writing, and I feel like my brain was just right. So I would ask the AI, I was like, oh, what's another way to say this? Or is there something missing here? And so not to do the job, but to just give me that feedback right away.
Yep.
To consider, that I might word something differently, or that I might, look at something else. Yes, conversational aspect of it was nice because, I think in the doctoral research and research in general can be kind of isolating at times. And you're not always working with a big team or anything. And so, if I can get that collaboration or conversation going to help me in the moment, it's really powerful tool in that sense.
Very good. Thank you. Thanks.
Yep,
Thanks,
for the
Jim.
opportunity
Appreciate
to
it.
chat.
So let me see. Coco, are you with us? Have you joined for a second? I don't know if he's available. May not be. So anyone else, as we get to, we're coming up to the top of the hour. Are there any other questions for Ashley? Hi, Coco. How are you? Good to see you. You joined right from the top of the call. Any thoughts about Ashley's presentation today from your perspective? No, you're on mute, sir. You're on mute.
Oh, good.
We can hear you now.
Okay, thank you so much for this opportunity. Can say please excuse me, I came a little bit late, but I came at the slide which was talking about the STEM. This has come directly to somehow the same project I'm implementing in Kigali. Since a month, in Kigali, implementing a tuition and daycare centers for kids, because really, Rwanda is a country which try to organize a good governance, but for education, really the education is low. So we decide with some partners, we decide to try how to review the way of training kids from the bottom. If they have a good training, if they have a good coaching, that will complete the curriculum they pursuing on the primary school, and then we can, with that, we can prepare a next generations for a good professionals and good leader in the country. So I came across already across your slide where I saw you were talking about STEM, which is, I think, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, or something like that.
Yes.
Okay, we are
Mathematics.
coming across the same idea, so that we can really to see how we can not only promote kids, not only to give education to kids, but to give them skills. Not only education. Education is not enough for them or for us here, but we need skills. That's why we participate in doing researching, and we are planning now to develop center in every district in Rwanda. Then, because of the facilitation of internet connectivity in Rwanda, the fiber is somehow everywhere. Then I will copy the same project to Congo Democratic. So I very thank you, Mrs. Ashley. Please allow me to keep in touch with you.
Oh, yes, I was gonna mention too. So I mentioned earlier, I have a twin brother. I also have an older brother who is living in Kigali now in Rwanda.
Oh, okay, good.
My brother, sister-in-law, and all my nieces and nephew, they all live in Kigali.
Okay. Anyway, it's my second citizenship. I'm twin citizen from Congo and from Rwanda. Yeah.
Very good. So Ashley, you can let us know how you would prefer that we, anyone who wants to stay in touch, communicate with you. So
I will, actually, I will put my email here, my university
Yes.
email. Feel free to keep in contact with me.
Alonda 7.
Yes. ALANDER7 at North Carolina State University, NC.
North Carolina. Yes, North Carolina. Yeah.
And I will also include, if people want to connect through LinkedIn, I'll include my LinkedIn.
Okay, LinkedIn. Okay, that will be very easy. We start from there.
Okay, sounds good.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Alice. Mrs. Ashley.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Yes.
Coco, for joining us. So, Ashley, I don't see any other questions. We have comments, so you can, see those comments in chat.
Yes.
There's I recently read an article that said, "Oh, hallucination." That's a polite way of saying, the system's lying to you, all right? But it's it's a very interesting, the intellectual property considerations of what's going on right now is it's going to make some legal firms very wealthy over the years, I think.
Yes.
But we're moving very, the whole notion of scraping is is just creating a different world, different knowledge base. But what they can scrape is only a small percentage of human knowledge. So
What is interesting is we don't recognize, most people talk about AI, but they're really talking about ML. And ML is statistical based, and therefore hallucination should not be a surprise to anybody
right.
in large language models. So what we need to do is learn how to put it to work. And so that's why I see Midjourney as a hallucination that is an attempt to approximate your mental models that that you use as a part of your activity. And that's why it's a fun sandbox. So my comment was, how do we put us to work on that?
That's a great question. And something that's come up in my work in general too is, I think, you know, people are saying like, well, how do you know what you're going to get from, you know, Midjourney when you, and I think the reality is you only have so much control over it. If anybody's kind of interacted with the systems, you know, sometimes you get things that are, you know, just wildly different. And so I think you mentioned before being able to, where is it? Being able to challenge that what Midjourney is putting forward and seeing how it aligns with your own like mental model.
It's
and use it to refine and align to build that equivalence, that digital, that twin in essence, because it's going to be more useful as a metaphor if that twin is acceptable, if that metaphor is acceptable to your mental model.
Yeah.
And also ability to change that. It's a great sandbox.
Yeah, the ongoing.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say the ongoing intersection between the data training set for whatever system you're using and the prompt that you craft, you know, creates the ability to see an outcome, right, with these systems. And actually selecting the data training set that you want to use, if it's selectable, right, and being able to do that knowledgeably, and being able to be a great prompt engineer, right, to, you know, fully express yourself, that's beginning to show up as an actual job description characteristic. Are you, you know, good at prompt engineering or prompt crafting or whatever, you know, which is just a subset of, are you able to ask better questions?
Yeah.
And you're asking some good questions, Ashley. I mean, there's no question about that. And if getting bad information back or not what you want refines your level of discernment to say, well, is this actually real? That's a skill set. That's a skill set we're going to need going forward. So you were going to say, you just triggered something that it's kind of like that pushed a auto recording playback for me. Go ahead, Ashley.
I was just gonna say, along the lines of what we were saying, something my advisor has been calling it is this conceptual fidelity between your mental model and the with the AI outputs. And so how do you measure that overlap, right? Because you want it to be as matched as possible. So that's one of the ways that we've been thinking about that too.
I have not heard that term, conceptual fidelity. That's a good term.
I hadn't heard of it either. My advisor, Dr. Matthew Peterson, he just said it one day and we were like, that sounds like a really good way to, you know, to call it that.
100%. So let's wrap up. Based on where you're going, Ashley, what would you recommend that people, you know, should take away as the result of your presentation day and research? What should we consider as, you know, professionals and, you know, people in our own, how should we look at, you know, our opportunities to interact with others better as a result of the work that you've done so far? What would you either make as a recommendation or do you think is a key takeaway that we should think about?
Well, I think, on the research side of things and the technology side of things, one of the takeaways and something that I've been trying to kind of incorporate myself is to not feel like we just have to accept technology as it is in the way that it's presented, but also thinking about how we in turn help mold and shape how it is further developed. So, I've come across a lot of literature that kind of talks about, how AI machine learning is going to be used in the context of research. And some people, I think have kind of written it off to say, no, we're not going to use this. It's kind of racked with all this, this bad stuff. And so I think I've been taking the opposite approach to think about like, well, how can we kind of interrogate these systems, learn more about them so that we design them better in the first place. And so I guess one of the takeaway that I would say is to, get your feet wet with these things and don't be afraid to kind of, get in the mud of them to figure out how to make them better. And then also thinking about, not getting so wrapped up in just the automation and it can do all this, but also thinking about how this technology can help people, like actual people in the way that we live, and to, have better experiences, better lives. That's something that I'm really interested in, is that, as a designer, I design for and with people. And I think a big part of that is trying to understand people, get to know people, which I think sometimes in the context of research and academia, we get in our little cubicle, or even at work, we get in our little cubicles and things get kind of separated from the impact that they have on real people in their lives. And so I guess another takeaway is to just don't lose sight of that, and to always try to keep that connected.
Well, we really appreciate you sharing with us today, being part of the People-Centered Internet community call today. And we wish you all the best as you continue your research and, get through that final defense that will get you to the status of Dr. Anderson, which is, we look forward to that. Keep us posted. And everyone, thanks for being part of a great call today. And everything you do, be intentional. Cheers.
Thank you.